Today's story revolves around a man named Karl. Karl was born on January 25, 1947, in Munich, Germany. His father, Donovan Macken, was a military officer, and his mother was Erika Hess. Karl was not originally from Germany but was born there because his father, who was in the military, was stationed there for an extended period. His parents moved to Germany while his mother was pregnant with him, and that's where Karl was born. When Karl was 1 year old, his family moved back to the United States, specifically to San Antonio, Texas, where he grew up as an only child. In 1964, Karl graduated from high school and started college, but he dropped out shortly after, realizing it wasn't for him. He thought perhaps following in his father's footsteps by joining the military might be his true calling. He enlisted in the U.S. Navy and served for 4 years, but much like his college experience, it didn't fulfill him. Feeling restless and dissatisfied, Karl left the Navy in 1969 at the age of 22. After leaving the Navy, Karl relocated from Texas to Seattle, Washington. He stayed there for a short while but didn't enjoy living there. Eventually, he returned to Texas and later moved to Anchorage, Alaska. It was in this city that Karl discovered his true passion, wildlife photography. He loved venturing into the vast wilderness, capturing images of wild animals, and selling those photos for income. After purchasing the necessary equipment, such as cameras and lenses, Karl began exploring forests and wildlife reserves, taking photographs of animals from a distance. For years, Karl continued this work, and it brought him immense joy. He often embarked on long trips into the wilderness, sometimes staying away for weeks. In 1976, he decided to embark on a particularly ambitious journey to explore a large mountain range called the Brooks Range, which spans over 1,100 kilometers in central Alaska. Karl planned this trip meticulously, ensuring he had all the supplies he needed, and spent 4 months in the wilderness. This was the longest trip of his life and one that brought him great happiness. In 1981, Karl planned another similar journey, but this time, he wanted to stay for 5 months instead of 4. He was excited and enthusiastic about the trip, unaware that it would be his last. The story is just beginning, and the mysteries are waiting to be unraveled. Woman Detective Flashlight. If you're ready to dive into a world of thrills and suspense, don't hesitate to subscribe to our channel and join us on this journey filled with intrigue. Hit that subscribe button and turn on the notification bell so you never miss a single thrilling detail. Come on, let's continue the story together. In March of 1981, after gathering all his equipment, food supplies, camping gear, and other necessities, Karl arranged for a pilot to drop him off in the wilderness. He also made plans for a friend, who owned a small plane, to pick him up at the end of the trip. On March 25, Karl arrived in the remote wilderness near a large unnamed lake. His first task was to set up his tent and organize his gear. He then went to the lake to fish and later returned to his campsite to cook the fish over a fire. Karl was thrilled to be surrounded by nature and enjoyed the solitude. Over the course of the 5 months, he lived his dream life, photographing wildlife, hunting for food, and marveling at the beauty of the surrounding wilderness. He kept a detailed journal of his daily activities and adventures. The day of his return arrived in August 1981. That morning, Karl woke up early, packed up his belongings, and waited for his friend's plane to arrive. As he waited, he noticed that he still had a lot of leftover canned food and decided to take it to the lake and dispose of it, thinking he wouldn't need it anymore. After finishing, he returned to his tent to wait for the sound of the plane. Hours passed, but there was no sign of his friend. Karl assumed his friend might be running late but would still arrive that day. That day turned out to be Karl's last in the wilderness. He spent the evening fishing and enjoying the beauty of the lake. When night fell and his friend still hadn't arrived, Karl began to worry. He thought about what could have gone wrong but remained hopeful that his friend would show up the next day. He lit a fire to keep warm and wrote in his journal about his final day in the wilderness, noting how much he enjoyed the trip and the stunning photographs he had taken. Carl's story, however, ends on a tragic note. He was never seen again, and the details of what happened after that day remain a mystery. To embark on a similar journey again, Carl wrote down in his journal that his friend was running late. As he sat there, the sun began to change, the sky darkened, and there was no sign or sound of an airplane. At that moment, Carl started to feel a bit uneasy, thinking, maybe my friend forgot the time he was supposed to come and get me. The problem was that there was no way for Carl to contact him. That evening, Carl set up his tent again and crawled inside to sleep, hoping that his friend would arrive the next day. But the following day came, and his friend didn't show up. Days passed, and no airplanes flew in that area. It was silent, and a week went by after the agreed-upon date with no sign of his friend. Carl sat down, deep in thought, wondering what could have delayed his friend. Could he have died? Maybe something terrible happened to him, he thought. Then, he remembered that the night before starting his journey, he and his friend were at a bar having drinks and had gotten a bit drunk. That night, Carl had said to him, "Look, I'm going on a long trip into the forests of Alaska. Can you pick me up with your plane on August 7th? His friend replied, "Of course, I'll come and get you. But first, I need to confirm whether I'll be free at that time or if I'll be traveling myself." Carl's friend had a busy schedule because of his demanding job. In his excitement about the trip, Carl didn't follow up with his friend the next day to confirm whether he'd be available or not. Nor did he arrange for anyone else to pick him up when his trip was over. He simply left, assuming that his friend would definitely come to get him. As he reflected on this, Carl opened his journal and thought, maybe my friend got too busy, or maybe I didn't even confirm the pickup date with him because I was a bit drunk that night. It dawned on Carl that he had really messed up, and no one was coming to rescue him. Even Carl's parents, even if they noticed his absence, wouldn't report him missing to the police. He had previously gone on a trip, stayed longer than expected, and didn't return on time. His father, terrified at the time, had gone to the police to report his disappearance. A search effort was launched. When Carl eventually returned and saw everyone panicking, including the police, he had asked his father to never report him missing again, even if he stayed away longer than expected. Now, Carl was all alone in the middle of the forest, far away from everything. The major issue was that winter was approaching, and Alaska's winters were brutal. Temperatures could drop to -40°C, -40°F, and it would be nearly impossible for Carl to survive in such conditions. The entire month of August passed, and Carl accepted the fact that he was truly alone and that no one was coming to save him. Despite this, he began thinking about how he could survive there. He had made a big mistake earlier by throwing his food supplies into the lake when he thought his friend would come to get him soon. And honestly, why he did that, no one knows. Even if he didn't want the supplies, why not leave them somewhere accessible instead of in the water? After thinking carefully, Carl saw two possible options before him. 1. Stay near the lake and fight to survive until someone randomly showed up to rescue him. Carl had experience living in the wild, he knew how to fish, hunt animals, and start fires. He figured he could keep doing this and maybe even dry and preserve animal meat to last through the winter. His plan also included waiting long enough for his parents to grow concerned and report him missing, prompting the police to search for him. 2. Make the 120-kilometer journey to a small village. The villagers there could call the police and arrange for someone to pick him up. However, the trek to the village was extremely risky. The path was treacherous, with mountains, steep slopes, and the constant risk of falling to his death. Food would be scarce along the way, unlike at the lake, where he could fish. Additionally, the entire route to the village was known for being home to many wolves, increasing the likelihood that he might not survive the journey. After weighing his options carefully, Carl decided to stay near the lake and pray that a plane or someone on a camping trip might pass by the area. He knew winter was fast approaching and that he needed to start hunting animals and drying their meat to survive the cold months. Each day, Carl recorded his thoughts and actions in his journal. Meanwhile, back home, Carl's father began to grow increasingly worried. He reasoned that no matter how much Carl loved exploring, it wasn't like him to stay away this long. His father debated whether to inform the police or wait a bit longer. Ultimately, his father decided to notify the authorities, despite knowing that Carl might be upset with him for doing so. After all, Carl had explicitly asked him not to involve the police the last time this happened. Despite everything, Carl decided to inform them, just so they would know that he was okay. Indeed, they sent a small plane to the area to check on him and make sure nothing had happened. On the day the plane came, Carl was sitting in his tent, lost in thought about his situation. Then he heard the sound of a plane. At first, he didn't believe it, thinking he might be imagining it, but the sound kept getting louder. Carl was very excited. He quickly ran back to his tent, grabbed his orange jacket, and ran outside, waving to the plane to get its attention. The pilot saw him and circled the plane over his tent. Carl rushed back inside, grabbed his things in a hurry, and ran out again to see what was going on. There, he saw the plane flying away until it disappeared. He was puzzled and confused. Why had the plane left? Was it that the pilot couldn't land? The pilot had seen him, Carl was sure of it, but he left. Carl's head was spinning, trying to figure out the reason, but there was no logical explanation. Later, he decided to focus on something else. He had caught a rabbit earlier, so he skinned it and sat by the fire for a while. After eating, he tried to sleep, but sleep wouldn't come. His mind was still racing. He got up again and decided to read one of the books he had brought with him. But after reading through them multiple times, they had become boring. While flipping through the books, Carl found his hunting license. He decided to read it and pass the time. On the second page of the license, Carl came across something that made his blood run cold. Fear gripped him. In that instant, he understood why the pilot had flown away after seeing him. Days passed, and Carl waited every day for another plane to rescue him, but nothing came. By the beginning of October, he had given up and accepted the reality. He started considering walking to the nearest village, but winter had already begun, making it impossible to move freely. The cold wind and snow kept him trapped near the lake, where he struggled just to survive. By early November, the lake had frozen over, leaving him without food or water. He couldn't even start a fire, as all the wood had frozen. Carl knew he couldn't survive much longer. On November 6, 1981, he sat in his tent, watching the snow fall. He knew the situation was hopeless and came to a grim realization. There was only one way out, and that was to end it before he died slowly from hunger, thirst, and the cold. He picked up his journal and began writing everything that was on his mind. He wrote a letter to his father, expressing his love and how much he had enjoyed life with him and his mother. He told his father to sell the photos and videos he had taken during the trip and keep the earnings for himself. Carl told his father to take everything in his tent, except for the weapon, which he said could be taken by anyone who found his body. At the end of the letter, he wrote, "Please, God, forgive me for what I'm about to do. I have no other choice." His final words in the letter were, "This is not Carl's fault." Carl then took the gun, placed it against his head, and pulled the trigger. A month after Carl's death, his father went to the police and insisted they check on his son. Indeed, they got up to leave, but it was already January 1982, and the weather was too harsh. They couldn't move at that moment, so they waited until January, and then they sent 2 planes to check on Carl, to see what he was doing and if he was still there. When they arrived at the exact location, they found his tent still standing, but it was sealed shut. When they opened it, they found Carl's body inside. Since the weather was freezing, it hadn't decomposed much. They found all of his belongings there, and among them were his journals, which detailed everything he had gone through during the journey. If Carl hadn't written in his journals during the trip, we would never have known his story. We would never have known the simple mistake he made that cost him his life. Carl died at the age of 35. His father was devastated by the news and couldn't accept the idea of his only son dying in such a way. Now, the question everyone might ask is, why did the pilot fly so close to him, see him, and still turn around and leave? I told you earlier that when Carl was in his tent and heard the sound of the plane, he went outside and saw that it was indeed a plane. He quickly ran back inside, grabbed his jacket, and waved to the plane with one hand, signaling that he was okay and asking them to go on their way. When the pilot saw him waving with just one hand, he assumed Carl was fine and still wanted to stay there, so he turned back and left. When Carl's father heard the news, he couldn't accept it. He thought, this is impossible. Carl wouldn't want to stay there. He knew winter was coming, and he would have wanted to leave. They told him, your son said he didn't want to leave, he was okay. Carl never knew about the instructions on his hunting license, but when he read them later, he understood. Had he read those instructions earlier, he would have known that lifting one hand meant, I'm fine, go on your way, but lifting two hands meant, help me, come get me. If Carl had only known the proper signal, he might have been saved. Anyone going on an adventure should always read the instructions carefully. It doesn't take much time, but it could save your life if you ever find yourself in a dangerous situation. Unfortunately, Carl lost his life in the most tragic way just because he lifted one hand instead of two. His body was returned to his parents, and they held a funeral attended by many people. Carl became known as the man with the worst luck in the world because of one simple mistake that cost him his life. Thank you for watching. If this story sent shivers down your spine, there's so much more waiting for you. Our world is full of mysteries, hidden horrors, and stories that lurk just beneath the surface, stories you don't want to miss. By subscribing to this channel, you'll be the first to uncover terrifying tales, mind-bending mysteries, and chilling legends that will keep you on the edge of your seat. So, if you love suspense, if you crave the unknown, or if you simply enjoy a good scare, hit that subscribe button now. And don't forget to turn on the notification bell, because the scariest stories always come when you least expect them. See you in the next story, if you dare.